Welcome, everyone. We'll try to start on time. My name is Marcelo Gleiser. I'm a professor of physics and astronomy here at Dartmouth, and I also direct the Institute for Cross-Disciplinary Engagement, which is the short for the institute is ICE, but I say it's the good ICE, because there's another ICE out there. So it's the good ICE, or as a previous seller said, the coolest ICE, So if you want to know more about what we do, I'll write a little website for you. One of the things that we do is we have a fellows program, somewhat similar to the Montgomery Fellows, where I invite wonderful people that do cross the boundaries between the sciences and the humanities to spend some time here and think and talk to people and give public lectures. And so today we're very, very fortunate to have as our current fellow Alan Lightman, who I'm sure you know as a physicist and as a novelist. Alan was educated in Princeton and at Caltech, where he did his Ph.D. in theoretical physics, I guess, with Kip Thorne, who just got the Nobel Prize for gravitational waves. And then he was at the Harvard-Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics as an assistant professor, and then at MIT, where he had this distinction of having both a position in the physics and in the humanities, which is something I'm very jealous of, I have to say. I think that's a wonderful thing. And in fact, he became the John Burchard Professor of the Humanities. And then he decided to take some time off a little bit from academia. And so now he's just an adjunct professor there where he teaches science writing because he wants to dedicate more time to his fiction writing and nonfiction writing. So, as you know, he's the author of 5 novels, 2 collections of essays, a book-length narrative poem, and many, many books on science. And he's written for The Atlantic, Granta, The New Yorker, The New York Review of Books, and many, many other publications. His novel, Einstein's Dreams, was an international bestseller. It has been translated into 30 languages. And his novel, The Diagnosis, was a finalist for the 2000 National Book Award in Fiction. His most recent books are Screening Room, a memoir of the South, named one of the best books of 2015 by the Washington Post, and The Accidental Universe, named by Brain Pickings, Maria Popova's blog, as one of the best books of 2016. He's also a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He's received many, many awards and 5 honorary degrees. And on top of all that, Alan also is the founding director of the Harpswell Foundation, which works to empower a new generation of women leaders in Cambodia. So he goes there quite often to do this work, which is quite wonderful. So today he's going to talk to us about fact and faith. I almost said fact and fiction. Fact and faith, which is really the main theme of an upcoming book of his that I'm sure he will mention while he's talking about. So Alan, please welcome. So Alan will talk for about 45 minutes, and then we'll open for questions from the audience. When you ask a question, I'm going to give you a microphone because we are videotaping everything. Okay, so please, thank you.
Thank you, Marcelo. I very much admire the work that Marcelo has done with this institute here to bring the sciences and the humanities together. I've had a great experience being here for a week, and I'll be here another 10 days or so, and I've had some enjoyable meetings with some of the students here. So thank you, Marcelo. Thank you, ICE, cool ICE. Thank you, Dartmouth. For many years, my wife and I have spent our summers on a small island in Maine. There are only 6 families who live there. There are no roads or bridges to the island. And everybody on the island has to have their own boat. And the story I wanted to tell concerned a particular night. It was after midnight, and I was coming back to the island alone in the boat. I was very quiet, and as I was rounding the tip of the island, I decided to turn off the running lights of the boat. So what little light there was disappeared, was completely dark, and then I decided to turn off the engine of the boat, and it got completely silent. And I just lay down in the bottom of the boat and looked up at the stars. And I don't know whether any of you have looked at the stars from the ocean on a quiet night, but it is a mystical experience. And after a few minutes, the boat disappeared, my body disappeared, and I felt like I was falling into infinity. I felt like I was connected to the stars, and not only connected to the stars, but connected to nature. I felt like I was part of something much bigger than myself. I felt like I was part of something eternal. And after a few minutes, I turned on the engine of the boat. I got up. I didn't even know how long I'd been lying there. So as Marcelo said, I've worked as a physicist for many years, and I've always held a purely scientific view of the world. And by that, I mean that I believe, and I think that most scientists do, that the world is made out of material and nothing but material, and that material is governed by a small number of fundamental forces and laws, and that everything in the world, including humans and stars, is material and will eventually return to their component parts. And even at the age of 12 or 13, I was impressed by the logic and the materiality of the world. I built a little homemade laboratory for myself and did experiments. And one of the experiments I did was to measure the swing of a pendulum. And I had read in Popular Science or some such magazine that the time it takes a pendulum to make one complete swing was proportional to the square root of the length of the string of the pendulum. And it was a beautiful law, which I verified with the help of a watch and a ruler. And it seemed to me that everything in the world was quantitative and logical, that cause and effect governed everything. And as far as I could tell, there was no reason to believe in a supernatural being or anything supernatural. And that's pretty much still my view. But after that experience in the boat, many years later, I understood the powerful attraction of the spiritual world. I understood the powerful allure of believing in the eternal and the non-material, in the ethereal, in things that were unchanging and eternal and sacred, believing in things and experiences that are not reducible by logic. And at the same time, and perhaps paradoxically, I remained a scientist. I remained committed to the material world. I have a good friend in Cambodia. I go there twice a year. I have a good friend who is a venerated Buddhist monk. And sometimes I talk to him about scientific and theological matters. And as some of you may know, the Buddhists believe in something called the Four Noble Truths, which deal with suffering and how to relieve that suffering. My monk friend was careful to explain to me that Buddhists come to the belief in the Four Noble Truths by experience with the world. But there are other things that Buddhists believe in, like the fact that the universe has gone through an infinite number of cycles that are based exclusively on the word of the Buddha, who was a person, a human being named Siddhartha Gautama. One of the names for the Buddha is the Lakavidu, which in Pali means the knower of worlds. And a lot of the authority of what the Buddhists believe comes from the statements of the Buddha, the Lakavidu. And I wondered, how do we know that the Buddha was the knower of worlds? Were Einstein and Darwin also knowers of worlds? The truths and the laws that we believe about the physical universe and the spiritual universe, why do we believe them, and on whose authority? Science and religion differ profoundly in the way that truths are discovered. Can everybody hear me? Good, because I'm not too close to the microphone here. In religion and theology, these truths and beliefs seem to have two origins. One origin is the sacred books, like the Bible or the Quran or the Vedas or the Pali Canon. And believers have faith that these sacred books express the true word of God, and therefore the authority comes from the infinite wisdom associated with God or with other divine beings. The second origin of truth and religious knowledge is more personal. It's what one might call the transcendent experience. So I wanted to talk a little bit about these two kinds of knowledge in religion, and then I'll turn to the knowledge and method of science and try to contrast the two. Quotations from the sacred books are used to declare truths ranging from the origin of the universe to the question of free will, even to reproductive biology. And let me quote a passage from the Islamic Hadith, which is supposed to be a quotation spoken by the Prophet Muhammad. This concerns reproductive biology. He is created of both, he being man and woman, he is created of both the semen of the man and the semen of the woman. The man's semen is thick and forms the bones and the tendons. The woman's semen is fine and forms the flesh and the blood. And still today, there are many religious thinkers who attribute absolute authority to the teachings of the sacred books, which is called divine revelation. Let me quote from a part of the announcement of the Second Vatican Constitution endorsed by Pope Paul VI. This was in the mid-1960s, and I quote, "The books of Scripture must be acknowledged as teaching solidly, faithfully, and without error the truth which God wanted put into sacred writings for the sake of salvation." I do respect the notions of God and other divine beings. However, I insist on one thing. I insist that any statements about the physical world, and that would include the origin of the universe, reproductive biology, and so on, I insist that statements about the physical world be tested by the methods of science and rejected if found to contradict experiment. The spiritual world has its own domain, but the physical world must be the province of science. In the physical world, the laws of nature cannot apply to some phenomena and not others, and apply at some times and not other times. It's not okay with me if the principles of aerodynamics work on some of my airplane flights, but not on others. Most religions take God to lie outside the physical world, outside of time and space. Because science is restricted to the physical world, science can never disprove the existence of God. And I am impatient and frustrated with some of my scientific colleagues like Richard Dawkins and Larry Krauss, who attempt to use the methods of science to disprove the existence of God. I think they are just totally missing the point. Likewise, we can never prove the existence of God. Belief in God must be taken as a matter of faith. Let me turn to the transcendent experience, which for me, as both a scientist and a humanist, is the strongest and most compelling evidence that we have for a spiritual world. By transcendent experience, I mean the immediate and vital experience of being connected to something larger than ourselves, of feeling some unseen order in the world. And by the spiritual world, I mean the totality of these experiences. The experience I had in Maine, lying at the bottom of the boat looking up at the sky, was a transcendent experience. I've had many others, and I'm sure that all of you have had transcendent experience as well. The transcendent experience may or may not involve a supreme being. Unlike the received wisdom of the sacred books or the teachings of the institutions of religion, the transcendent experience is intensely personal, and the authority of that experience rests on the experience itself. There's no one who can refute a personal transcendent experience that you've had. It cannot be disproved, and often the transcendent experience is a unique one-time event. The transcendent experience as an avenue to truth is a deeply human experience. In fact, there are some philosophers and theologians who believe that truth exists only in the realm of humanity and the human mind. Such a belief runs head-on against the beliefs of science, which are that there is truth and reality outside of the human mind. Doesn't the parabolic arc of a tossed coin exist whether or not there's a human mind to conceive it? These opposing views between whether truth can exist outside of the human mind or must necessarily be within the human mind were highlighted in an extraordinary conversation between Einstein and the great Bengali poet and philosopher Rabindranath Tagore, who won the Nobel Prize for Literature. Einstein and Tagore had a great admiration for each other, and they met a couple of times. Once was in July 14th, 1930, at Einstein's house in Kaput near Berlin. And I want to read you a portion of their conversation. Einstein: truth, then, or beauty, is not independent of man? Question mark. Tagore: no. Einstein: I agree with regard to the conception of beauty, but not with regard to truth. Tagore: why not? Truth is realized through man. This is before political correctness, or it's gender tilted. Einstein: I cannot prove that scientific truth must be conceived as a truth that is valid independent of humanity, but I believe it firmly. I believe, for example, that the Pythagorean theorem in geometry states something that is true independent of the existence of man. Anyway, there is a reality independent of man, and there is also a truth relative to this reality. To Gore, truth, which is one with the universal being, must essentially be human. Otherwise, whatever individuals realize as true can never be called truth, at least the truth which is described as scientific and which only can be reached through the process of logic, in other words, by an organ of thought which is human. Einstein, the problem begins whether truth is independent of our consciousness. To Gore, what we call truth lies in the rational harmony between subjective and objective aspects of reality. I think that's a wonderful exchange. Well, I want now to discuss the knowledge in science and the way that we arrive at that knowledge. And I think scientific knowledge is of two types. First is there's the description of physical objects, such as the mass and the size of a raindrop, the measurement and description. And second, there are the laws that govern the physical world, which we call the laws of nature. One of the first human beings to formulate a law of nature was 2,000 years ago, Archimedes, his law of floating bodies. And let me quote that law for you. Any solid lighter than a fluid, and lighter meaning less dense than a fluid, will, if placed in the fluid, be so far immersed that the weight of the solid will be equal to the weight of the fluid displaced. We can speculate on how Archimedes arrived at this law. 2,000 years ago, there were scales and balances for weighing things because there was trade at the market. So Archimedes could have taken a rectangular box filled with some fluid, put an object in the fluid. First, he could have weighed the object on the scales. Then he'd take a rectangular box filled with fluid, put the object in the box, measured how much the water or fluid level rose, how many centimeters it rose, then multiply that by the area of the container to get the volume of water displaced. Then in another container, fill it up with that volume of water and weigh the amount of water, and then compare that with the original weight of the object. And he would have done this many times to arrive at his law. He also would have used fluids other than water, like mercury, to get to the generality of the law. And in fact, all laws of the physical world are like Archimedes' law. They're precise, they are quantitative, and they are general, applying to a large range of phenomena. It's possible that nature wouldn't obey laws at all. For example, it's possible that we would live in a universe where 2 + 2 = 4 and 2 + 2 = 3, a universe like that. But most scientists believe that universes that didn't obey laws would have self-contradictions like that mathematical one I just said. Certainly, it would be an unlawful universe. Would be a very frightening place to live. In the last 200 years, we have discovered laws that govern the behavior of the insides of atoms, the expansion of the universe, the orbits of planets, and many other phenomena. And from those laws, we've been able to explain in quantitative detail everything from the color of the sky to the orbits of planets to the mass and size of raindrops. And we have seen no evidence to contradict the notion that all phenomena in the physical universe are governed by laws. And here's a wonderful law of nature that you can confirm this yourself. Take any object like a pin and drop it to the floor from a height of 4 feet and time how long it will take to reach the floor and the gravity of the earth, and you'll get a half a second. Now drop the object from a height of 8 feet, and you'll get about 0.7 seconds, and then drop it from a height of 16 feet, and you'll get 1 second. And what you find if you drop the object from several different heights is that the time it takes to fall doubles with every quadrupling of the height. This is a rule of nature, a law of nature. It was discovered first by Galileo in 1590. It's called his law of falling bodies. And with this rule, which you can do yourself at home, you have discovered the lawfulness of the physical world. The law of the swinging pendulum that I confirmed myself at age 12 was an example very closely related to Galileo's law of falling bodies. And I didn't believe it was true because I read it in popular science. I didn't believe it was true because I wanted it to be true. I didn't believe it was true because the great Galileo had said that it was true. I believed that it was true because it worked. It evidently described a real property of nature. Let me describe the methods and the manner of science. Galileo's law of falling bodies is a special case of Newton's more general law of gravity. Newton discovered his law about 50 years later by analyzing the orbits of planets. For 2 centuries, Newton's law worked beautifully. But then in the mid-19th century, it was found that the orbit of the planet Mercury didn't quite fit Newton's law of gravity. It was off by a very tiny amount, amounting to about 1/100th of an angular degree every century. An incredibly tiny discrepancy, but the telescopes were so good at that time, the observations so careful, that scientists agreed that there was a problem. Then in 1915, Albert Einstein proposed a new law of gravity replacing Newton's theory of gravity, which explained this orbit of Mercury perfectly, also predicted gravitational waves, which were discovered about 1.5 years ago, and many other phenomena. And now the important point. We know that Einstein's theory, as beautiful and accurate as it is, will also be replaced someday by a more accurate theory. Now, all of the laws of nature discovered by scientists are considered provisional. They're considered to be approximations to deeper laws. They're constantly being revised as new experimental data comes in and as new ideas come forth and are tested. And in fact, what we call the laws of nature should really be called approximate laws of nature, because in any given time, we're only working with approximations. Even if there are final laws of nature, perfect laws of nature, at any one time, we're working with approximations to those final laws. And it is in this process of revision that we see the strongest difference between science and religion. As I've said, everything in the physical world is subject to laws, but we have only approximations to those ultimate laws, which we're constantly revising. The beliefs and knowledge of religion, coming either from the divine authority of the sacred books or from the transcendent experience, are not subject to revision. They are not approximations. Religion does not revise itself in the way that science does. There is something that scientists believe that cannot be tested according to the methods of science, and that is a principle I call the central doctrine of science. And that principle says that the physical world is governed by laws, and that those laws are always true everywhere and at every time in the universe. I call the central doctrine of science a doctrine because despite its past success, it cannot be proven. No matter what laws we have, we can't be sure that tomorrow we might observe some phenomena that is a miracle, that just cannot be explained by any laws. Our faith in the doctrine is so strong that when we find physical phenomena that seem to be unlawful, like the orbit of the planet Mercury, we don't abandon belief in a lawful universe. When it was found that the orbit of Mercury disagreed a little bit with Newton's theory of gravity, we did not attribute the discrepancy to something mysterious, to the action of a whimsical god, or something that was intrinsically unexplainable. We realized that our theory needed revision. And in fact, I can't imagine any event in the physical universe that would cause scientists to label it as a miracle, to abandon belief in a lawful universe. If this table started floating right now, scientists would look for some magnetic levitation or some other law that they hadn't yet discovered, but not a miracle. We are deeply committed to the central doctrine. There's another belief in science that cannot be proven, and that is belief that there is a final theory that is perfect, that is beyond approximation. And many physicists call this a final theory. Such a belief has not emerged from science itself. In fact, the history of science shows that we're constantly revising and revising and revising and revising. So belief in a final theory is just a matter of faith. And the irony here is that even if we were in the possession of a final theory, we wouldn't know it, because you couldn't prove that tomorrow you might observe some phenomena that disagreed with the theory. So we believe it as a matter of faith. In his book, Dreams of a Final Theory, the Nobel Prize-winning physicist Steven Weinberg writes, quote, "Our present theories are only of limited validity, still tentative and incomplete. But behind them, now and then, we catch glimpses of a final theory, one that would be of unlimited validity and entirely satisfactory in its completeness and consistency. My own guess is that there is a final theory, and we are capable of discovering it." A final theory is really an extension of the central doctrine of science. In sum, I would argue that despite the huge differences between science and religion and the way that knowledge is acquired, that both share a certain degree of faith, a belief and commitment to the unprovable. Science experimentally tests everything that it believes, with the exception of the fundamental belief, the belief in the central doctrine of science. I wanted to end by talking about some of these issues in a more personal way and specific way, and that is my personal attitude towards death. One could argue that many of our religious and spiritual beliefs are motivated by a knowledge of our own impending death. We confront our own physical demise with invoking the eternal, the immortal soul, God, and so on. All material things are made out of atoms and molecules and the energy that holds them together and the forces and energies that hold them together. And atoms and molecules are part of the physical world. And according to the view of science, all material is governed by laws. Immortality is not allowed by the laws. Disembodied existence is not allowed by the laws. Insubstantiability is not allowed by the laws. I'm a materialist, as I said when I started, but I consider myself a spiritual person, so you might call me a spiritual materialist. So the question is, how does a spiritual materialist think about his own impending death? I believe that this distinction between life and death is overrated. I've come to believe that death occurs gradually through the diminishing of consciousness. And let me explain what I mean. According to the scientific view, we are made of material atoms and nothing more. In fact, to be precise, the average person is made out of about 7,000 trillion atoms. The totality of our tissues and organs are composed of these atoms. And according to the scientific view, there's nothing else. To a vast cosmic being, each of us human beings would appear as an assemblage of atoms, humming with our various electrical and chemical energies. To be sure, it's a special assemblage. A rock does not behave like a person. But the mental sensations that we experience as consciousness and thought, according to science, are purely material consequences of the purely material electrical and chemical interactions between atoms. And when we die, this special assemblage disassembles. The total number of our atoms in our body stay the same, but they are scattered about. Particularly special in these considerations is the brain. In the view of science, the brain is where our self-awareness originates, our self-identity, our ego, our consciousness, our I-ness. Neuroscientists have studied the brain in great detail. They know a lot about the brain. There's a lot that's still unknown. There's good evidence that the processing and storage of information in the brain occurs principally through the neurons. We have about 100 billion neurons in our brain. These are brain cells. The electrical and chemical interactions between the neurons are largely understood. The manner in which electrical signals speed down a neuron, then are converted to a flow of chemicals that go to the next neuron. These things are understood very well. The long-term memory that we have upon so much of our self-identity rests is accomplished by the material generation of new connections between neurons and the reinforcement of existing connections by specific proteins. We've seen new synapses grow between neurons. We know which proteins are involved. Despite all of this, despite the known material nature of the brain, the sensation of consciousness, the ego, the I-ness, is so powerful and compelling, so fundamental to our being, and yet so difficult to describe, that we endow ourselves and other human beings with a mystical quality, some magnificent and non-material essence that goes far beyond the individual atoms in our brain. To some people, that mystical thing is the soul. To some, it is the self. To others, it is consciousness. The soul, as commonly understood, we cannot discuss scientifically, so I will not even attempt to discuss it. But that's not the case with consciousness and the closely related self. Isn't the experience of consciousness and self an illusion caused by those trillions and trillions of neuronal connections, the connections between neurons and the electrical and chemical flows? And if you don't like the word illusion, then you can stick with the sensation itself. You can say that the self is a name that we give to that sensation of all of those electrical and chemical flows between the neurons. And by saying this, I don't want to diminish in any way the brain. The human brain is capable of wondrous feats of imagination, creativity, self-reflection, thought, but I do claim that it's all atoms and molecules. If the giant cosmic being that I referred to earlier examined a human being in detail, he, she, or it would see fluids flowing, sodium and potassium gates opening and closing on neurons as electricity races between the nerve cells, the chemical flows between synapses, but he, she, or it would not find a self. The self and consciousness, I think, are names we give to those sensations. Having said that consciousness is simply a name we give to those sensations, I want to make the point that I don't think that consciousness can be understood simply by the microscopic analysis of individual neurons. The brain has roughly 100 million neurons in it, and when you have a very large system like that composed of many, many elemental parts, then there is a behavior of the system as a whole that cannot be predicted and which is qualitatively different than what individual elements do. And this is called an emergent phenomena. Another example of an emergent phenomena is a snowflake. Snowflakes are made out of crystalline ice. Ice is water. Water is made out of molecules. Molecules are atoms of hydrogen and oxygen. And we can know everything about the orbits of electrons and atoms and hydrogen and oxygen. We can know how those atoms join together to make molecules. We can even understand the six-sided symmetry of a snowflake. But when you put billions and trillions of those molecules together, including very tiny interactions with the environment of the snowflake, then it is impossible to predict the zillions of different patterns that snowflakes form. It cannot be understood by analyzing individual elements. Now, let me come back to death. If someone began disassembling my brain one neuron at a time, depending on where the process began, I might first lose a few motor skills, then some memories, then perhaps the ability to find particular words and sentences, the ability to recognize faces, the ability to know where I was. During this slow process of taking apart my brain, I would become more and more confused, disoriented. Everything that I associated with myself, with my ego, with my self-identity, would gradually dissolve away in a bog of confusion and minimal existence. The doctors in their blue and green scrub suits who were taking apart my brain one neuron at a time, they could drop those neurons, each one in a metal bowl. Each would be a tiny gray gelatinous blob. Each would have the spindly dendrites and axons coming out of it. You wouldn't hear each one drop because they're very soft. Likewise, the doctors in their blue and green scrub suits could create consciousness by building a brain from scratch, one neuron at a time. They could slowly add neurons together, delicately arranging the connections between neurons, one neuron at a time. And the doctors might hook up an electrical device to monitor the electrical activity of these neurons. And for a long time, there would just be noise. But at some point, presumably, a qualitative change would occur. Some coherent signal, an unusual hum that would translate roughly into, yikes, something is messing with me. If we conceive of death as nothingness, then we cannot imagine it. But if we conceive of death as the complete loss of consciousness, a view supported by the understanding of the brain as a material object, then we can approach death in gradual stages as consciousness fades and dissolves. The distinction between life and death would then no longer be an all or nothing proposition. The neuroscientist Antonio Damasio has defined several levels of consciousness. The lowest level he calls the proto-self, and that's just an organism that is able to carry on the most basic processes of life, but nothing else. An amoeba has a proto-self. I would not associate this level with consciousness. Surely you need a minimum number of neurons to have consciousness. Next comes what Damasio calls core consciousness. It's self-awareness and the ability to think and reason in the present moment, but without memories of the past. And certain people with brain disorders have core consciousness. You would be able to understand the world around you, but you would exist only in the present. You cannot form memories that last more than a few minutes. You cannot remember what happened to you in the past except for isolated periods. You cannot make plans for the future. You're trapped in the moment. And the highest level of consciousness, which all healthy people have, is what Damasio calls extended consciousness. Here we remember most of our past life. We can remember our view of the world based on past experiences. We can remember places that we've been. We can remember what we like and what we don't like. Self-identity, as most psychologists define it, probably requires extended consciousness, that is, long-term memories. These, of course, are very difficult issues. The slow dismantling of a human brain, whether by my imaginary doctors in their blue and green scrub suits or by the deterioration of the brain in a neural disease, might proceed from extended consciousness to core consciousness to the proto-self. Or perhaps it might proceed in a less orderly manner by removing chunks of extended consciousness here, chunks of core consciousness there, until one is left with a proto-self. Either way, one begins with full consciousness and ends with an amoeba-like existence. One begins with a full life and ends with death, or the equivalent of death. And this process can happen gradually so that there may be some awareness of the increasing loss of awareness. Personal accounts of early dementia provide the best knowledge we have of approaching death in this manner. In the early stages of dementia, where enough of the mind remains to understand and articulate what's happening, you can understand how consciousness is gradually being lost. But in later stages, the person has slipped into an abyss of confusion. Somewhere in the intermediate zone, the sense of self dissolves and is gone. I know this is a very grim subject. Many of you probably know people or have relatives who have had dementia. I've had some loved ones who have had dementia. I currently have a friend who lives in Michigan who is dying of Alzheimer's, and she writes me letters frequently, and I can see the loss of her self fading away. Now I wanted to end with something truly personal. From a scientific point of view, I believe everything that I've said about the materiality of the brain. I've laid it out. But I'm not satisfied with this picture. In my mind, I can still see my mother dancing the bossa nova. In my mind, I can still hear my father telling his Cushmaker joke. And the punchline is, it went Cush, and I can have another one up in 15 minutes. I often wonder, where are they now, my deceased parents, my father and mother? I know the materialist explanation, which I've just told you, but that does nothing to relieve my longing for them and the impossible truth that they do not exist anymore. I am alive, and I'm enjoying it, aching joints and all, despite my belief that I'm only a collection of atoms, that my awareness is passing away neuron by neuron. I am content with the illusion of life. I'll take it. And even though I do not believe in a heaven or hell, when I do not believe in the immortal soul, I find a pleasure in knowing that 100 years from now, and even 1,000 years from now, that most of my atoms will remain. Those atoms will not know where they came from, but they will have been mine. Some of them will have been part of the memory of my mother. Some of them will be the vinegary smell of my first apartment, the memory of that. Some of them will once have been my hand. And if I could label each of my atoms at this moment, write my Social Security number on each of my atoms, someone could follow those atoms for the next 1,000 years as they floated in the air, mixed with the soil, became parts of plants and trees, dissolved in the ocean, and then floated into the air again. Some of my atoms 1,000 years from now will be parts of other people. Some will be parts of other lives, other memories. And some, after that long journey, will return to the island in Maine. So that's how a spiritual materialist thinks of his own death. Science and religion have been the two greatest forces that have shaped human civilization. I think they both express something deeply human about us. They're both here to stay. And so let the dialogue continue. Thank you.
This works, yes. Good. So thank you so much for this. And I'm sure some people may have questions, comments. Wow. Oh, there you go. We can start there.
Hey, thanks on behalf probably of everybody here. I much appreciated the talk. It seems as if there's something in common between the scientific approach and the faith-based approach, in that both are asking why. Why did that happen? Why did something happen? And with science, we test hypotheses. And some of them, you come across consciousness and you say, well, we can't understand it. It's sort of mystical in a way. And it's not surprising to me, therefore, that some people would say, well, there must be something bigger, something greater involved. So it's not surprising to me that there's this difference, in part because they seem to both be asking the same question.
Good comment. Yeah, I don't think I need to respond to that. I agree with what you said.
Okay. There was a hand. Yeah.
Perhaps you've provided an answer to this question and caused me to find some comfort. But I've always been troubled by the uncertainty of quantum mechanics. The further you investigate into material, the less certain it becomes. You've kind of addressed that, but perhaps it's worth some additional thought from your side, how it fits in and how it's explained.
Well, it's not true. It's not quite true that the further we investigate quantum mechanics, the more uncertain it becomes. The uncertainty in quantum mechanics, well, what it says explicitly is that you, for example, that you can't know precisely where a particle is and at the same time know precisely how fast it's moving. But there is a quantitative relationship, a quantitative equation that tells you exactly how much that trade-off is, that uncertainty is between position and motion. And when we have large numbers of particles, we can convert that uncertainty to probabilities, and we can predict very accurately how a large number of particles will behave. There is a fundamental fuzziness of nature at the smallest scales, but I don't think that it's true that uncertainty is getting larger and larger as we learn more and more. I think we have been able to put a box around that uncertainty and even quantify it. And we actually have equations that express that uncertainty. There are a lot of philosophers and ethicists and theologians have invoked quantum mechanics, or the uncertainty in quantum mechanics, to express theological and ethical issues, philosophical issues, such as whether we can have free will versus whether we have free will in making choices, or whether our actions are completely determined. If there's a little bit of uncertainty, maybe that explains some arbitrariness in our actions. But I think that most of those arguments are misusing quantum mechanics. So I don't mean to dismiss your question at all, but I do think that quantum mechanics is not the place to look for this union or sympathy between science and religion.
We all seem to struggle with this concept of consciousness and life in itself, in fact. And I might offer the concept that the universe and everything in it is in fact alive, is conscious and sentient, and is intelligent. And therefore, the phenomena that we see that we don't understand do have an intelligence behind them, even though it is not of our understanding. I don't accept the supernatural, but I know that there are phenomena that we cannot explain today, but that certainly can be part of our natural universe.
Back.
Thank you for your talk. I have no question, just a couple of observations that are personal about consciousness, and I'll just let them float out there. To my youngest students, I used to say, if we accept that the universe is just a series, and I'm a non-scientist, this will be pretty clear to you, but if we accept that the universe is just a series of random accidents of physics and chemistry, isn't it pretty remarkable that it ends up with you on one level? And another thing I think about quite a lot, although I have not read up on it, is that, and this is about my personal consciousness, who writes, scripts, casts, and directs my dreams? Because it is not me.
The comments are floating. Okay.
Thank you so much for your talk. I was wondering, so as a Muslim from a religious point of view, I can understand where ethics and morality derives from in terms of, okay, assuming God created you, God understands you best, he knows how this whole machine works, and you follow the rules prescribed by God. Where do, I guess, where do the ethic, or where's the source of ethics and morality from a more materialistic or scientific worldview? Yeah, I guess that's primarily it. Yeah.
Well, first of all, I do not think that you need a divine being or a creator to develop, for human beings to develop a sense of ethics and morality. That doesn't mean that such a being doesn't exist, but it just means I don't think it's necessary. I think that some of our ethics and morality evolve, and maybe all of it, from evolutionary forces. That is, for our own survival. And I think that E.O. Wilson might have written a book on the altruistic gene. Marcel, am I right about that?
Wrote a lot about altruism.
Yeah. And according to that idea, and of course we can't prove the idea because evolution happened over millions of years, that your feeling, your tender feelings for other people and the desire to help them could have originated from the desire to preserve your community, not just yourself, but your family. If one of your family members survives, then they can help take care of you. And so through the process of evolution, when lots of different random processes were occurring, and some were beneficial for survival and some weren't, the desire to help your fellow human being in certain ways could have had survival benefit for you, and thus would have been preserved, that trait. The very strong feeling that you have for a mate is clearly of evolutionary benefit to form a union that allows the protection of the children while they're growing up. I know this is a very cold-hearted explanation of ethics and morality, but this would be the materialist explanation, I believe.
Hello. Yeah. So, as you're sitting there with these men in the blue and green suits and having your brain dismantled, neuron by neuron, they're taking the neurons and putting them into a jar and remaking another brain that has the exact same shape as the one that they're dismantling, just in a different place. And slowly, as your consciousness goes down to the point where it disappears, and the consciousness of the brain that's forming in the jar slowly peaks up into a, yikes, what's happening to me? What are your thoughts there on the continuity of self? And is the consciousness that wakes up in the jar a continuity of you sitting at the table?
Well, that's the basis of a wonderful science fiction story, and I of course don't know the answer to that, but I think it would be a great. Here's where I do think that physics would come in, and that is I think that you could show that it's impossible to recreate the brain exactly starting from scratch. That is, if you're given all of the positions of all of the atoms in my brain, I think it would be impossible to recreate that exactly. So there'd be little errors here and there. You know, this one nerve filament was supposed to connect to this neuron, and it didn't. It connected to that one instead. And so I don't think that it would be actually possible. But if it were possible, that it's a great question of whether my consciousness would suddenly appear somewhere else. I think that eventually, when we understand the brain well enough, that we may be able to download a lot of the information in our neurons and put it on a piece of silicon. And then the answer is, does that have a consciousness, and how is it related to the original consciousness? But it's a great question, and I hope that you will write a sci-fi story based on it.
Having a public dialogue in Boston in the spring of 2018 on transhumanism, which is pretty much one of the things that deals with this kind of stuff. One last question. There was a lady here. Did you still have a question?
Well, it was just a free association. If I could take a moment to share it.
Yeah.
While you were speaking, I was just kind of remembering this counterculture Catholic church group I was in back in the 70s in California. And the Catholic priest during the communion, you know, we'd have communion together, he would say, now, you know, we can be imagining that we're just sharing in now all of what creation is made of, and the body and blood of Jesus, and the stuff of all of what creation is made of, and it's all material and it's all spiritual. And someday we'll know that it all goes together. So thank you. That's.
Okay, I guess on that note, I'll thank you all for coming, and stay tuned for more. Thank you. Bye.